ini daripada aku di
hari ini. Hello, Peter.
Hi, Yusui.
Hello.
Ooh, got some nice feedback there somewhere.
Just a second. How's your day?
Been really good, thank you. I did send you an email a moment ago that I managed to pick up my car a moment ago, so that I don't have to go rushing off to get it. So no, that's good. So I'm happy about that.
Yeah. So you will have time to have a small reunion with some of the participants after the webinar.
If they would like to, yes. If they wish to sort of misbehave, and yeah, I've been a little busy today and a whole range of other reasons. Just a moment.
Yeah. Take your time.
Need to introduce you to the new member of the family.
Oh. What is her? She or he?
It's a she. It's a she. She's
And her name is?
She's what we call a kelpie, a sort of
Hello.
kelpie. So she arrived only on Friday.
Oh, how old is she?
8 weeks.
Oh, so it's like a baby.
Yeah, well, exactly.
She is a baby.
And she's been sitting underneath the desk today as I do things, sort of chewing up boxes and chewing my feet. So if for any reason during the presentation I suddenly sort of go, ow, it's probably because this thing has decided that it's going to start chewing my feet again or whatever. It's only a puppy, so it's got some learning to do.
Still a baby.
Very much so, Sui. Wow, 226. 7. Wow.
Yes, so you're famous.
Well, expectations.
Yeah. So shall we start now?
Whenever you're ready.
Yep.
Okay, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Shalom, Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. Dear presenter and participant, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen here. Hope all of you are healthy and in a good condition during this pandemic. Welcome to Visiting Professor Program organized by Faculty of Animal and Agricultural Sciences, Universitas Diponegoro. So firstly, let me introduce myself. My name is Kadung Prayoga. You can call me Kadung, and I will be the moderator today. So before the main agenda, I will also introduce to all of you the great speaker who have an international reputation. In this occasion, we have Prof. Peter Jibat with us, and here the detail of his curriculum vitae. So his name is Peter Jibat, and his nationality is Australia and New Zealand. And his email is peterjibat@outlook.com. So if you have any question, maybe you can contact him in his email. And his specialty is agribusiness, and his research field is food and agribusiness marketing. His affiliation is Curtin University and University of Western Australia. And for his formal education, he got his bachelor in 1978 from Lincoln University in New Zealand, and he got his master degree in 1996, majoring in marketing in the Curtin University. And in 2003, he got his PhD in agribusiness, also from Curtin University. And his professional experience from 1978 until 1983, he got a horticulture advisory officer in a Christchurch, New Zealand. And in 1983 until 1986, became a sales representative in a Guthrie Harvin, Auckland, in New Zealand. And in 1986 until 2014, in a Curtin University in Perth, in Western Australia. And 2014 till today, in agribusiness marketing and rural development consultant, Peter Jibat and Associate in Perth, Western Australia. So Prof. Peter today will deliver an interesting topic entitled Risk Management in Agriculture. So it's going to be a rare opportunity, exactly, that we can get a lecture from the reputable professor. I hope you can enjoy this class and get a lot of benefit from Prof. Peter. And after Prof. Peter presentation, we also have a Q&A session. If you have any question, you can put your question in the chat room. And before we move to the main agenda, we will capturing the moment. So for all the participants, please turn on your camera so we can capturing the moment before the main agenda. So please, to anyone, you can turn on your camera, and I will. Okay. 1, 2, 3. Okay, for the second slide. 1, 2, 3. Then for the third slide. 1, 2, 3. And next for the fourth slide. 1, 2, 3. So we have a lot of participants, so maybe a lot of capturing moment exactly. And for the 5th slide, 1, 2, 3. The next, 1, 2, 3. Next, 1, 2, 3. Then 1, 2, 3. Okay, next. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so it's already done. And without any further ado, Prof. Peter, so the time is yours to present your class about risk management in agriculture. So to Prof. Peter, time is yours.
Thank you so much, Kadung, and welcome everybody to this afternoon's presentation. Remiss of me, it should have been Selamat Siang. It's so great to be with you all again. Give me one moment while I just briefly chat as I zoom up the presentation here and share this with you.
Yeah, exactly, Prof. Peter.
There we go. Excellent. Okay. Look, thank you, Sui, particularly for having organised this. It was a pleasure to meet you when I was in Barajaya late last year, and for this opportunity to continue to work. Yes, it was in 2014 that Curtin University was in a process of restructuring, and to my somewhat surprise, I was asked if I would accept a redundancy. So after almost 30 years as a full professor, I was basically tossed out. It happens, and of course, as you can appreciate right now, within the whole Australian university sector, as a result of COVID, this whole thing is about to happen again, with some massive rationalisation amongst the universities as a result, fundamentally, of the reduction in overseas student numbers. So indirectly, while we're actually talking about this, you can of course appreciate and now understand that in terms of the topic about which we're to present here around risk management, then the current environment, of course, gives us an excellent example upon which we can draw a huge number of examples. Because COVID has been, of course, one of the most significant risks or risk factors that has had an impact, both positive and negative, upon agriculture and agribusiness. And so what I'm going to do today is give you a bit of an insight into the concepts of risk management. In fact, it was in 2013 or 2013 that I actually introduced risk management as a unit into the business degrees at Curtin University, because of the need for businesses to be more aware of risk and effectively how to manage it. But of course, risk management has been something that's been always inherent within agribusiness. And again, going back in time, I think it would have been probably around 2008, 2009, I actually taught what we called commodity trading and risk management, which within the context of again, agribusiness was more about how to manage commodity markets and futures markets. The other part of risk management that I really want to talk about today, and that I hope that you've all understood this, and in fact, if you haven't, and or again, for various colleagues from various universities around Indonesia, may I suggest that you certainly do, and it should be, is to look at some form of HACCP food safety management training embedded within your agribusiness courses, because managing food safety is paramount to everything that we do in agribusiness. So I'm going to draw here effectively then on a number of disciplines, firstly upon what I would suggest is the more traditional risk management theory, and then just go through the process by which we effectively analyze risk and by which we assign probabilities. And again, what we tend to do is to then think about the implications or the impact of that risk, so that we really as a business want to take actions to reduce risk that is going to have the most significant outcome. And so one of the other things that I'm going to talk about, which is very, very important, which is embedded again within this whole concept of risk management, is what we call the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle means that we do things before they happen. So rather than trying to face risk when we have it, we try to actually prevent the risk occurring in the first place. And this, of course, is very much the concept of asset-based food safety management programs. So again, as you can appreciate, then we're actually talking about risk management. To some extent, we're also talking about quality management and food safety, which again is then part of food quality management. So all of these things are actually embedded. They're all interlocked, but they become absolutely critical when we actually start to talk about risk management within agribusiness. What we need to appreciate is that in the majority of cases, most people dislike risk. No surprise there, is it? Nobody likes to live on razor blades. That's just too, we don't know what's going to happen. And so most people are risk averse. And that means that people are willing to then forego some expected return for a potential reduction in risk. That's what we try to do. We try to reduce our risk. The other thing that we need to appreciate is that when we talk about risk, we're generally talking about the downside risk. Now, we'll reintroduce this in a moment when we try to define risk, but for all decisions that we make within agribusiness, there's both what we call an upside and a downside. The upside is the potential benefit that we're going to gain from the decision. And it could be, for example, I'm going to make a decision to establish or to construct a polythene tunnel house, and I'm going to grow my tomatoes or my cucumbers or my capsicums, for example, by hydroponics, rather than planting in the ground, because that's going to reduce the incidence of soil-borne disease. And we would expect then to see a significant improvement in yield. But what about the fact that having established this greenhouse structure and or agribusiness enterprise, we then find that our yields are actually not what we expected or anticipated? There is then effectively this downside. And so when we talk about downside risk, we're talking about the estimate, a probability that a security or that some asset might actually decline if market conditions turn bad, or if some other external impact or influence has an involvement or impacts upon our business here. And this is what we need to understand and appreciate, that the impact here can be significant. We also need to look at the fact that when we're actually involved in risk management programs or processes, what we're actually looking at is the decisions that we make under assumed certainty. So in other words, what we're trying to do as risk managers is to assign probabilities. And I think we can generally do that because, of course, over time, we get to know that there are certain parameters within which decisions can be made. And what we're trying to do then is to operate within those parameters. But the trouble is that the parameters in which we're operating have an enormous spread. And sometimes the parameters go beyond that, and particularly weather. And this is particularly with, of course, within agriculture and agribusiness, the most significant impact that we're trying to actually manage is the impact of weather and how that then affects quality, how that affects yields, how that affects prices, and of course, how it affects things like pests and diseases and a whole range of other things. And because of that huge spread in things like rainfall and temperature, it's very, very difficult to actually then try to predict how then things might work out. And so this then, particularly within agriculture, becomes particularly complex because of what I describe here as these non-linear interactions. We need to appreciate that when we talk about yield, for example, in a crop, we're not just talking about the amount of nitrogen that we apply or the amount of potassium. We're also talking about pest and disease incidents. We're also talking about rainfall. We're also talking about wind. We're also talking about sunshine. We're also talking about pest and disease incidents. We're also talking about variety. So there's a whole lot of different factors here that are all involved. And so again, what we often talk about is that sometime within risk management philosophy, we get what we effectively call the perfect storm, when everything comes together in such a way that it just wipes us out. And that's the challenge that we're going to have. Excuse me, this happened last time. So what we effectively want to look, so effectively what happens then when we're in a situation then where we've got these downside and upside risks, what we tend to find is that the bad outcomes actually outweigh the favorable outcomes. And so what we've got then is this situation that occurs within our business where it becomes really, really difficult to actually evaluate or to assess what is going to be the good outcome, what is going to be the bad outcome. But what we do tend to know is that within agribusiness, the bad outcomes are always better than, or surely not, I shouldn't say better than, worse than the better outcomes. And that's what we talk about, this concept of a downside risk. In other words, what we're seeing is that the issues then around trying to manage downside are far more significant to the management and operation of our business rather than the upside in our business. So when we talk about risk management, what we're effectively then talking about is the systematic application then of management policies, procedures, and practices which seek to identify, analyze, assess, treat, and monitor risk. Now, this sort of framework around which we utilize to manage risk is a generic framework that comes from a whole range of different places. And in fact, any risk management textbook that you pick up is going to provide you with this basic framework. But before we get to that framework, we need to have a greater appreciation and understanding of what we actually mean by risk. And so we need here to think about the types of risk that are actually going to impact or could potentially impact our business. And so again, as we spoke a moment ago around upside risk and downside risk, we need to appreciate that there is the risk associated with taking an opportunity, which is generally going to be negative. But there's also a risk associated with not taking the opportunity. In other words, if we decide that we may be in the process of perhaps introducing a new product, a new variety, or in some way trying to respond to consumers' needs, we identify an opportunity within the market. We do a basic risk analysis. We look at our business and our position within the industry, but we decide not to take that opportunity. Now, there are going to be some significant negative short-term and long-term consequences of our decision not to actually take an opportunity. But by the same token, had we then gone forward and decided to introduce a new product into the market, we may not meet or reach the anticipated or expected sales levels. And that can, of course, place our business under more financial pressure. So let's not forget this concept here of opportunity-based risk. It can be both positive and negative. What most of us do appreciate and understand when we talk about risk is what we describe here as uncertainty-based risk. And of course, uncertainty-based risk is associated with unknown and or unexpected events like natural disasters, like typhoons, like floods, like droughts. And of course, as we've seen in more recent times, like COVID. These uncertainty-based risks are extremely difficult to quantify because we don't know how bad they're going to be. Like, how did we know in January or February, when COVID first raised its head, that COVID was going to have the impact that it has globally in terms of its negative impact on food value chains, the disruption in food value chains, and hence the shortages of product, particularly within urban cities. But the difficulty too that emerges here is the difficulty that we have in seeking to control these uncertainty-based risks. They are very, very hard to control, which means that we can't really do much about them. Remember before I talked about these precautionary approaches or proactive approaches where we try to anticipate that something bad is going to happen, but there's not much we can do. So, for example, if a typhoon does come through and smashes out your banana plantation, or if you have an unexpected rainfall event that causes a huge amount of flooding, well, other than assuming or looking towards doing the best that you can to establish things like shelter belts and ensure that your crops are adequately drained, there's not much that you can actually do. I know who this is. Sorry, I hope that's done it. Pull the pin and we won't have any more disruptions. The other thing that particularly within the food industry that we're going to have are what we call hazard-based risks. And with hazard-based risks, we're talking here about physical, chemical, and biological risk. And of course, this is the stuff that is most obviously often associated, as you would suggest here, with food and food safety. So as you can see here, the obvious physical risk of finding something in your bread that shouldn't be there, like this mouse. So the question then begins is, how did that mouse, how did that physical contaminant get into my bread? What about the chemical risks? What about the biological risks? What about also the psychological risks and the risks particularly that, again, COVID is actually having upon so many people in the world today in terms of impacting and influencing our well-being and particularly our mental health? But there are also issues around things like ergonomic risk, where we're looking here at things like occupational health and safety and worker safety. You know, what can we do to resolve those sorts of problems in our workplace? And that might include, for example, then looking at the size of boxes or containers of sacks, for example, in terms of importing seed potatoes into Indonesia. You don't want to, for example, import or expect people to carry a 50-kilogram bag of potatoes. It's too heavy. So we're going to need to repack the product in smaller quantities so that it can actually meet the expectations of the people who are actually going to be handling this product. So hazard-based risk is something here that we can obviously take various steps to actually look at how we can actually overcome or reduce the likelihood of these risks. We also need to look at risks from the point of view of trying to classify them. And as Kadung had indicated in his introduction, thank you very kindly, you know, I'm fundamentally in marketing, but of course more in food and agribusiness marketing. And of course in marketing, we all know that we have 4 Ps, product, price, promotion, and place. In risk management, we also have 4 Ps, what we describe here as people, premises, procedures, and products. So when we start looking at the people skills and the people risks, we start to understand some of the problems that potentially we're going to have to deal with here. And again, if we start to think about COVID, for example, so many of the farmers right now in Western Australia are losing crops because we haven't got, as a result of the border closures and lockdowns, in terms of both getting out of Australia and getting into Australia, we don't have the migrant labour that we ordinarily would have. And so there's no one to pick the strawberries. There's no one to pick the stone fruit. There's no one to harvest the grapes. So there's going to be a potential increase in prices this year because of so much of the product going on the ground, because we haven't got the capacity and ability to actually harvest. If we think about premises, we actually start to think here about the damage to or the contamination to the premise, like, for example, our polythene structure that we're using to cultivate the eggplants, the tomatoes, or the cucumbers. The damage to or the breakdown of physical assets, like, for example, again, at the moment, we're about to go into the harvest of our broadacre field crops, our wheat and our barley. The last thing you want is for your combine harvester to break down in the middle of the field. There's also this issue around things like damage, theft of physical assets. You know, there's a real risk here that people are actually going to take things that are not theirs. Then there's the processes. The processes, the actual disruption then to processes that can occur right back at sort of the planting stage and occur then at any stage throughout the cultivation of a crop. Because again, of breakdowns in equipment and machinery because we haven't adequately maintained them. And this same thing, of course, can occur in food manufacturing. And thus, again, this is where we talk about this proactive precautionary approach where we actually do things in advance to ensure that we reduce or minimize the risk of breakdowns at critical times. And of course, we talk about product risk. The product risk here is associated obviously with either product failure and or service quality failure. That is the inability to actually get our goods to the market and to meet our customers' expectations. But of course, there's also going to be quality issues in terms of things like the presence or absence of chemical residues, biological residues, and a whole range of things that could occur, for example, through the quality of the irrigation water that we might be actually applying. So if, for example, we do have a situation where we have chickens that are nesting or living basically over a fish pond, for example, the feces is dropping through into the fish pond. We then take that feces and then irrigate crops. There's a high probability here that we could actually contaminate crops with salmonella. And that, of course, as a food safety incident, is going to have a major impact on our brand and on our market share and, of course, our reputation in the market. So we need to be able to manage these different types of risks. So when we start to think then about risk and uncertainty in agribusiness, what is it that we're actually thinking about? What are the most common risk factors that we tend to experience? And as you would expect or anticipate, both quality and yield are probably going to be the most significant. However, it's not just quality and yield, it's also markets and price, and particularly the price variations, the volatility in price. And the challenge or the difficulties here that what farmers so often experience is that in a good year, and in part why I spoke earlier about upside risk and downside risk, when everything actually goes well, we so often actually get a lower price because of the oversupply in the market. And remember then, it is actually this supply variable that tends to have the major impact in terms of the prices that farmers receive. But there can also be legal and institutional risks that are coming through as a result of changes in government policy or international policy. So that if you're thinking about, for example, in Indonesia, exporting star fruit or perhaps some other commodity, salak, to Europe, understand and appreciate that there are a whole lot of things around market entry. In other words, you're going to have to be Europe GAP or what is now called Global GAP certified. You're going to have a quality management system. But what we can also see, though, is that these institutional barriers can be ratcheted up by the retail chains that you might happen to be dealing with. So while Global GAP gives you the minimum standard for market entry, the requirement to supply Tesco's or Carrefour or Sainsbury's is a great deal higher than what is actually required by the minimum legal requirement. Then there are commercial risks, and of course commercial risks operate at both ends of agribusiness in terms of your inability to procure sufficient supplies at the appropriate price. And of course here we talk about chemicals, we talk about fertilizer, and the example that I gave you a moment ago of labour, and hence the potential wastage of crops. But there are also financial risks. Financial risks associated, of course, in part through commercial risks, particularly with non-payment. So buyers take your product, but the buyers don't pay. And so what are you going to do then? Because without that income, how are you then going to be able to pay your workers and pay the bank and all the other problems that you have? We also need to think about this thing or this issue around what we describe here as technological obsolescence. And this basically relates to the fact that we buy technology, but the technology, by the time we actually implement it and get it into our business, it's already redundant. There are already better quality products in the market. So you might think about it, purchasing, for example, a mobile phone. And you think of you do your analysis of Samsung versus Apple versus whatever, and then make a decision. But by the time you actually get the phone, it's redundant because a competitor has brought a new or superior product to the market. And of course, then we're dissatisfied and unhappy with the quality of the product that we've just bought. And this happens all the time, particularly in industries where we've got rapid technology innovation occurring. There's also the risk, as we spoke a moment ago, in terms of both human and personnel, particularly in terms of worker health and safety. And as we saw a moment ago in the example from Western Australia, the inability to actually secure enough people to actually help us with the harvest, and hence a reduction in yield as a result of an inability to secure or to be able to get enough people to undertake the activities that we require. Associated with this, of course, is also assuming or looking at the risks that the people that we do attract don't have then the necessary skills to undertake the work that we're actually trying to achieve. So there's a whole lot of things here that you can start to see that are all impacting and influencing risk and uncertainty. And let's not forget this concept of food safety, because everything that we do in agriculture and agribusiness is driven first and foremost by food safety. Our consumers expect that the product that they will buy is not going to be harmful. And so we as producers, we as processors, we as retailers and in the food service industry, we have to take appropriate steps to ensure that the food we provide to our consumers is safe to eat. That's first and foremost. So how then do we manage risk? What are the various strategies that we can implement at an agribusiness level to actually manage risk? Well, one of the first of the things that we can look at is to avoid risk. And that sounds like a pretty simple solution in reality, but effectively what we're saying here by avoiding risk is that we don't engage in risky activity. But think that through. And as we talked about opportunity risk, remember there's both an upside and a downside. So to some extent in agriculture, it is by its very nature a risky industry, and it becomes particularly hard to actually avoid risk. Because if we do try to cocoon ourselves like a silkworm and try, shut ourselves off from the world, we also shut ourselves off not only from the risks, but also from the opportunities. And as we know, in any basic strategy, we're going to have to deal with this concept of what, if you can recall, the BCG matrix, the Boston Consulting Group matrix. And if you recall that and how that impacts then on things like product life cycle, products can be defined as those products that are problem children. That is, we don't know how they're going to perform in the market. There are those that we call stars that are going gangbusters. Then we've got our traditional products that are in their mature stage that are making all the money for us. And then, of course, there are the dogs, those products that have gone beyond the market. People no longer want them. And so if we acknowledge then that within the product life cycle, products are going to constantly come into the market and products are going to constantly leave the market, we have to be investing in our future. We have to engage in opportunity risk. In other words, we can't avoid risk. But some of the obvious things that we can do at a farm production level are to look at things like diversification. So rather than just growing one crop, we actually grow a variety of crops. And of course, it's not only Indonesian farmers that undertake these activities, it's also the sort of thing that Australian farmers would do. So we don't just plant wheat, we don't just plant barley, we don't just plant oats and or canola. We might do all four. But the decision that we make and how we're going to allocate the proportions is based on the anticipated prices, upon the history, and of course, trying to determine, predict, or look at how climate change might obviously impact on our crop decisions as well. We can also look at specialization, which is going the other way, where we become particularly good at what we do. And this is one of the main reasons that, again, I spoke a moment ago, I gave you the example of perhaps growing tomatoes, cucumbers, or bell pepper under a polythene structure or a tunnel house. Because by specializing in a protected crop, sure, we're increasing the asset, but by also increasing the asset value, we're also reducing the risk and uncertainty because we're removing some of those uncontrollable factors, particularly weather. When we talk about pricing, there's a whole range of different alternatives here, and we can use a whole lot of different tools that include things like price averaging. We can use pools. We can use a combination of forward contracting and spot pricing, or indeed for most commodities like wheat, like barley, like rice, and to some extent like palm oil, there are actually futures or options. So in other words, we're actually buying futures contracts that allow us to be able to manage price. And we deal in a thing that's described as the basis. I don't want to get into too much more detail here because this is a whole separate sort of lecture in itself to try to get you to appreciate and understand how commodity markets work, or at least futures markets work. But we must also acknowledge, not so much at a smallholder level, but certainly when we start moving into larger, shall we say, corporate agriculture, which might include in Indonesia things like, for example, palm oil and or sugar, that there are expectations in the business sector that the businesses will be able to manage risk. We're expected to be able to manage risk within these large corporations, and particularly if you were, again, a company like, for example, Indo Food or Hero or Matahari, you're going to have to be able to manage risk in terms of your supply base, and also managing risk in terms of how that could then potentially impact on your customers and consumers. So that's going to require us to engage with our suppliers in ways that are beneficial. We're also going to have quality management systems in place to reduce the fact that if a consumer gets sick having purchased a product from our store, that doesn't damage our brand or our reputation. And hence there are all of these issues around compliance, also in relation to things like Food Safety Acts and other standards where product must meet and or comply with that standard. And so it's these things that collectively then require us to actually undertake a risk management strategy. And that's what we're going to look at now, is very broadly what this framework is to establish and for us to be able to manage risk. The first thing that we generally look at is what we describe as the context. We need to assess the strategic, organizational, and risk management context within which the operation, our business, is operating, be it at a production level or be it in food processing, food retailing, or indeed food service. Identify the risks. In other words, what can go wrong? Analyze those risks. And this is where this analysis comes in, where we need to think about what is the expected likelihood of this risk occurring. And if it does occur, what's the consequence? And so what we've then got to do is to look at the controls that we have in place and how then we can effectively minimize the risk occurring. That then leads us to assess and prioritize. In other words, which things are we going to attend to? Which things do we have to attend to? Which things can we leave? Because again, as managers, there's always this issue around constraints, isn't there? There's time constraints, there's financial constraints. We can't do everything at one particular time. So we have to make decisions about what things we need to do. So it's pretty obvious, isn't it, that in terms of risk management, we're going to address those risks which have the greatest likelihood of occurring, and of course those risks that have the greatest magnitude, so that if they do occur, they could be quite devastating. So what are we going to do to manage those? We'll worry about the little problems later, but first we address the elephant in the room. Don't worry about the mouse. Let's deal with the elephant. We then look at how we can treat those risks. What can we do to reduce the likelihood of that risk? How can we avoid it? How could we potentially transfer risk? Or how might we otherwise retain risk? I'll talk more about this in a moment. But appreciate during this whole process here that we're undertaking a process of monitoring and reviewing, because things are constantly changing. And that's what we need to appreciate, is that within our organization, within our business, we're dealing with dynamic change, a dynamic shift. We have to be able to respond to things continuously. And that also means then being able to communicate and consult, so that particularly within our organization, we need to be able to deal with our input suppliers, we need to deal with our workers, and we need to deal with the different workers at different levels of our enterprise. We need also to deal with our different customers. So we have to be able to communicate. And indeed, part of our risk management strategy is that communication. Because again, as I've said before, in terms of actually dealing with some of our potential customers, we have to have risk management processes in place before our customers will actually consider us. So when we're starting to talk then around these criteria, what effectively are we looking at? So when we talk about considering the risks, this is where we start to think about things at three levels: at a strategic level, an organizational level, and of course the risk management level. We need to think about the relationship between the organization and its environment. We need to think about things like the SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Our competitive position within a particular industry. And I spoke earlier, as you recall, about the BCG matrix in terms of problem children, stars, cash cows, and dogs in terms of the product life cycle. So again, what we're trying to do within our organization is determine where we are and what our strengths and weaknesses potentially are in terms of our product profile and the various processes that we use. But we also need to consider stakeholders. And here we need to consider all stakeholders. So this is going to mean input suppliers, it's going to mean customers, it's going to mean processes, it's going to mean governments, it's going to mean NGOs, and it's going to include a whole range of other people that are also involved here. So that if we think, for example, we're going to have climate action groups, we're going to have other consumer advocate groups, all of these people are going to impact the type of decisions that we actually take. We then need to look at our own organisation in terms of the process by which we establish and set up communication goals and objectives. And then, of course, when we talk about risk management, we need to establish these boundaries and these priorities. Which things are we going to do and which things which things can we do? I mean, that's one of the most important things for us to appreciate. There are some things that we cannot control. So identifying the risks. Here's where we need to basically sit down and think about, well, what can go wrong within our business? That's fundamentally what we're doing. What are the physical things that can go wrong? And of course, by the physical things here, we talk about such things as the weather and the environment, pests and disease. We think about financial risks, the fact that we may not get a price that is sufficient for us to cover our costs of production, the fact that our input costs could accelerate or become too high. What about things like exchange rates, particularly in terms of international trading? What about the legal risks that are associated, particularly in terms of if something does go wrong, what is the impact of that potentially on our business? Particularly, for example, and again, let me give you an example. 2008, the Food Act was signed here in Western Australia, which came into force then in 2009. But the Food Act requires all food businesses to be able to demonstrate that they have taken all appropriate steps to reduce the incidence of food poisoning. You have to have taken all reasonable steps. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to have a quality management program, but what it does mean is that if something happens, you have to be able to show that you have taken all steps, all appropriate steps to eliminate the risk from occurring. If you can't, you have a legal obligation and you're going to get basically done over in the courts, and potentially your business could be forced to close. But there are also ethical or moral issues here that we need to think about in terms of the fact that, I think we can all acknowledge that at certain times and at certain places and situations, we know that people have not acted ethically or morally. People have added product. And I guess the most well publicized of that, of course, was, if you recall, was in China, the incidence of adding melamine to milk, because the melamine improved the protein content of the milk. But of course, the protein content, the melamine then, of course, led to kidney failure and a whole range of death among infant children. Unethical behavior, but people did it. And that's what we need to appreciate and understand why they do things. Of course, that source of risk can be internal, it can be external, or it can also be random. And of course, particularly in terms of things like climate, it's really difficult. External, well, COVID's a classic example here of an external risk, and I doubt if there would be too many businesses in the world that were able to or had in place a COVID plan. They do now, but I guess that they wouldn't have had or didn't have in January, February. And of course, those internal things are the risks that can actually happen within our own organisations. So what we then need to do then effectively is to analyse the risk. So as I indicated here a moment ago, it's about assessing the likelihood of something happen. And we can look here at, on the left-hand side, at the likelihood in terms of things like, you know, it's might happen. There's a probability that it's going to happen. It's remote, unlikely. It's extremely unlikely, or as you can see here, it's extremely improbable. So we're starting here to see that we can actually think about the way in which we can classify these risks. Now, in developing a risk matrix like this, and if we were doing it for our own particular business or our own particular situation, we can create as many of these as we like. In other words, we could say that there's no risk, there's a 1 in 100 chance, there's a 1 in 50, or there's a 1 in 100. So we don't have to have, in this case, a 5-point scale here. You could have a 4 or even a 3. And this is the point that we need to talk about in terms of trying to undertake risk management, that while there is an established framework or mechanism for doing it, each business needs to do it for its own self. And so it needs to assess the likelihood and the consequences. And it in turn then needs to define the level of risk. And the level of risk then, as you start to see here, is low, moderate, high, or extreme. So there's a relatively low likelihood that this is actually going to occur. There's a moderate, there's a high, or an extreme. But defining these level of risks, as you can see here, come basically then from assessing the consequences of the action. So as you can see, then what we have is a matrix that on the left-hand side gives us the likelihood of something happening, and then across the top, horizontally, are the impacts of what could potentially happen should these risks occur in terms of minimal, minor, major, hazardous, or extreme. So in either way, then, when we start filling out this matrix, we start to appreciate very quickly what are the major risks that we need to evaluate and assess within our organisation. But how do you do this? How do you establish this risk matrix? Well, effectively, you do it through your own judgment. And that's the really important thing here, that with all risk management, it's about making personal judgments about both likelihood and consequences. There's no Bible or Quran that says, you know, go to this page and do that. You don't do that. It's something that each and every business is going to do. And so effectively what it then needs to be able to do is to, of course, gain information, or to be able to get information which allows it to look then at establishing that likelihood and, of course, establishing then the consequences of this occurring. So these risk matrices here need to be tailored then to the particular organisations. We also need then, of course, to evaluate the risk. Is the risk acceptable? So of course we then see our little mouse here making a basic decision. Is that, you know, is that little mouse going to have a go to get the cheese, or, you know, is he going to get crunched? That's fundamentally the decision that we have to make. We appreciate the importance of the activity. Yeah, I want that cheese. The consequence, well, if I get it, I'm not going to be hungry. But if I don't get it, I'm whacked. I'm dead. What amount of control then do I have over the risk? Well, if I'm a smart mouse, I can get that cheese. But if I'm not so smart, I'm dead. The potential loss, my life, the benefits, the cheese, the opportunity, the cheese. So that's the sort of decision that is being made effectively by organisations all the time in terms of assessing risk, in terms of then determining what steps that they need to take to be able to reduce or to manage that risk. And so when we start to manage risk, this is where we need to start then to identify the options. And effectively, when we start to identify the options, we start to see effectively that there are 4 things that we can do. We can avoid the risk, we can control the risk, we can transfer the risk, or we can accept the risk. Avoid the risk often means, as I suggested earlier, not making a decision at all. We can control the risk by, for example, in food, by having, at a production level, for example, good agricultural practice, or we could further down at the food processing level, obviously, have a HACCP management plan that would enable us to control the risk of introducing contaminants to our food. We can transfer the risk in terms of things like price to our buyer by entering into forward contracts. Or potentially we could transfer that risk by being engaged, as I suggested before, in terms of commodities or futures markets, where we trade options to either buy or to sell, and work then on the basis that we're going to win sometimes, we're going to lose sometimes, but by doing that, we're in a much better position than we would be if we were not to try to influence that. And nor we can accept the risk. And accepting the risk means we just get on with it. We just do it. So selecting the best option then, in terms of how we're going to manage that risk, the key question here, of course, ultimately comes back to who's going to do it, how are we going to do it, and is it cost effective? And this is where we need to realize that many of the options that in agriculture, like, for example, crop insurance, yes, while crop insurance is great, the premiums can be often so high that there's absolutely no value in actually undertaking or taking out crop insurance, because you're not going to be able to actually get around or to benefit, because the cost of the insurance policy is just so incredibly high. So then, in terms of managing the risks, what we obviously need to do then is to prepare a risk management plan. And of course, all organizations should have some sort of risk management plan. Certainly your bigger organizations, as we said before, there is now a corporate expectation that firms will have a risk management plan. And you then need to implement that plan. And there are issues here, both in the preparation of the plan and the implementation of the plan, because now you've got to ensure that all the people within your organization actually appreciate and understand that risk management is an important part of their activity, and that all those people then within the organization, again, adopt an appropriate proactive response or precautionary response to prevent problems from happening. So when we actually start to talk about quality management, we start to appreciate and understand that the costs of controlling quality, or what you could say, the costs of building quality in to our products and processes, is a great deal cheaper than actually trying to build to inspect quality out. So build quality in rather than inspect quality out. Because if you're thinking about inspecting quality out, you've already paid for the product, you've already paid for the process, and now you're dumping product because it doesn't meet your expectations. It's just money down the drain. But if we take proactive steps or precautionary steps to establish quality management systems, we can ensure that the product that does get to the end is product that will be accepted by our downstream customers. And so, as we said before, we come right back to this general philosophy about the fact that most people are risk averse. We go for this position of what we describe here as safety first, the precautionary approach. And this is what we need to do in terms of managing risk. We need to identify those risks. We need to identify the likelihoods, the probabilities, what causes those risks, and then take appropriate action to reduce the risk proactively. Because when it's happened, it's too late. And that's the important thing. We also need to review it from the point of view that in reviewing, we're trying to monitor and evaluate strategies. Because again, we're dealing in dynamic markets. Things are constantly changing. And of course, with change come new risks. So again, we start thinking about the fact that, for example, we could be wanting to diversify our markets. We might be wanting to enter a new market. With that new market, there's an opportunity risk, but there are also a whole range of other risks that are going to be associated with making that decision in terms of getting payment, in terms of financial risk, in terms of, the exchange rates. And what we even call, particularly if we're developing things like joint ventures, a whole range of issues associated with things like sovereign risk. So we do need to appreciate that there's an awful lot of issues here that potentially can emerge. Now, I'm realizing, and I'm very conscious of the fact that I'm gobbling up time at a rapid rate of knots. So what I'm going to do is race through this at an accelerated rate to get basically to the end, because I think that it's really important to talk about why we do it. The benefits of risk organization of risk management to the organization are significant. By undertaking an analysis of risk within our business, we actually get an improved understanding of our business and how our business actually operates. And that allows us then to, again, identify ways and means in which we can improve the performance of our business. And that leads, of course, as you would expect, then to increase productivity and efficiency. But it becomes really, really, really important here. So the more we understand about how our business actually operates, the better it is, or the easier it becomes for us to actually fine-tune the way in which our business operates. And that can, of course, lead then to enhanced competitive advantage. We gain an advantage over our competitors. It also gives our customers and/or our consumers greater confidence in the type of products that we offer. We get improved quality. We get reduced litigation. In other words, the likelihood of us having to go to court to deal with issues as a result of breakdowns in food safety management, for example, are reduced, because we're already acting proactively. We're adopting this precautionary approach. We're taking steps to avoid problems from happening rather than trying to fix up the problem after it's already occurred. And when we do try to fix the problem after it's occurred, that's going to cost. And so if we actually, again, take proactive steps to reduce problems, we're going to see this huge advantage in terms of our bottom line. We're going to actually reduce the costs, the wastage that occurs within our organization. And as you'll see here, we're also talking about this thing around continuous improvement and innovation. These are all factors that are going to occur within our business, and we need to be responsive to that, but we can't if we cannot manage risk. But, and there's always a but, risk management cannot make decisions. We make decisions. And risk management, as you can also see here, does not guarantee freedom from risk, because the risk is always inherent. It's always there. It's always present. So, and hence in this regard, it's not fail safe. You're always, from time to time, going to have unexpected things happen, or the business having to respond to risk. Sure, you do everything that you can, but it's still going to happen. And again, take the example, as we spoke earlier a moment ago, about COVID. So even if organizations do have quality management plans and HACCP management plans, very few would have had any sort of pandemic plan. And so, of course, when COVID hit, that's why it caused such massive disruption to value chains, because people didn't have alternative strategies. They weren't managing the risk because they didn't foresee it or anticipate it. That's the difficulty. That's what we're having to deal with. We also need to realize that risk varies between individuals. So the type of risk that is experienced by people in agribusiness is going to depend where they are in the agribusiness sector. As you can see here, for growers, most of the risk is going to be around production risk. And this, of course, is going to be around things like weather and climate, as that is going to impact things like yields and pest and disease instances and quality. But it's also going to impact on price risk. So that, as I spoke before, in a particularly good year, when everything goes right, farmers dream of this, but all of a sudden they don't get prices because everybody else is in the same position and prices crash. So you get basically, and again, from experience in both Indonesia and indeed in the Philippines, farmers actually get better prices when the quality is not so good, because usually of the scarcity of supply. So after a typhoon, for example, prices go through the roof for anything because there is no other product. It's been wiped out by the typhoon. So here's this issue then around yield, quality, and price. When we start dealing with the merchants that are involved in the value chain, we start to see that there are problems here in terms of pricing, basis, what we call the basis, which again is dealing with these commodities and futures markets, and what we call carrying. So in other words, the carrying costs are the fact that having purchased the product, you're storing it, you're putting it into storage so that you can amalgamate it prior to shipping. So you consolidate. But the problem is that that product sitting in storage, let's think of potatoes, kentang, for example, that product could rot as a result of bacterial wilt. And so all of a sudden, the amount of potatoes that you have in storage is significantly less than the amount of product that you had before, but you've already paid for it. So there's a real risk here, a real cost associated with carrying. So you see that again within storage here, we've got supply risk, we've got quality risk, because again, farmers store in the expectation prices are going to go up. But if the prices don't go up, I've incurred all these additional costs with putting the product in storage, again, opportunity cost, but there's also the impact potentially of quality because the product will rot, and so my yields will actually decline as the product sits in the storage for a longer period of time. And then for traders, then, you know, there's the risk at the other end in terms of the fact that, again, they are selling with an anticipated demand for the particular product. And what happens then if that demand doesn't come? We're suddenly stuck with all this surplus product. And as you can see here for consumers, we've got all the risks that are associated here with supply, price, and quality. So again, what we actually see here is that during a period of abundant supply, prices are low. When supply is tight, prices are high. And of course, the quality risk, which relates again to the food quality itself and its freedom then from chemical, biological, and physical contamination or constraints. If we look then very briefly at producer risks, and this comes from some work that was undertaken by Rabobank. I'm sorry, it relates to Australian producers rather than Indonesian, but I would imagine it to be very similar. The main risks that producers face are such things as the weather. It's the major risk, as you see here, 51%. But there's also the price risk, which is the second most significant risk for farmers. Now, in Australia, acknowledge that we tend to export a lot of product. And Indonesia, of course, is one of our major markets for a whole range of different commodities, fresh fruit and vegetables, milk, dairy, lamb, beef, a whole range of different commodities. Currency exchange rates are a big issue in terms of our international competitiveness. Then the market risk. And the risk here relates to the fact that we're dealing with international suppliers. We're only just one of many. And so there's always a chance that somebody else can provide a better product. And if I think about, for example, selling oranges or jeruk into Indonesia, it's not just Australian product, it's also product from South Africa, it's also product from Egypt, there's product also from the US. And so this competition then within the market can create difficulties and problems for us. Pest and disease pressures, cash flow pressures, again, most often associated indirectly with both price and quality, and this product safety issue. So coming back again to the fact that we need to think about food safety in everything that we do. And here's just a simple example here of how widely prices indeed can fluctuate. This is an example here for wheat, where you can see over the years here from September 2006 to 2011, by just the amount of variation that you see in the prices, and hence the difficulties with being able to manage that. As we talked about before, from the trader's perspective, there are going to be risks in terms of supply, their inability to secure delivery of the product, the contractual performance risks where counterparties don't fulfill their contract obligations. And of course, within a country like Indonesia, this is going to occur where you do have things like contract farming, and where people side sell is the word that's so often used, where they divert product away from you as the potential customer. Then there are all these issues around price volatility and or the lack of price volatility, because traders often deal, that's how they make their money, through a volatile market. Not getting the product of the quality that they expect or anticipate. And so if it doesn't meet then the quality standards of their downstream customers, what are they going to do with it? Because they've already bought it. So there are all sorts of issues here. The phytosanitary risks associated with hygiene and purity. And again, if I'm to talk here from examples, very recently, Australia has just been hit by China imposing a whole range of new restrictions. And indeed, we now face an additional 80% tariff for the importation of barley. And only this weekend, one of our major exporters in Queensland, a company called Emerald, has been rejected. It's no longer allowed to export to China because of hygiene and purity issues. Then there's this issue around futures price, and as we talked before about how we actually manage that and the risks associated with trying to do that. The timing risks, where we get mismatches between hedging and the physical transactions that can occur in, for example, a grain market, like, for example, rice or rice futures, palm oil or other commodities. The fact that the commodity doesn't trade as we expect or anticipated. Damage to the product and storage. The risk, as I talked earlier, of non-payment. And particularly in terms of export market, the problems associated with faulty documentation. When your product arrives in the market, the documentation doesn't align with what's actually in the shipment. And that can cause a snarl up, which particularly for things like perishable products can have huge consequences, and hence your inability to actually get the product to the market at all before it composts. Then there are, as I spoke earlier, these legislative risks that, of course, the policy environment is constantly changing, as to give you the example a moment ago of China imposing new barriers or constraints on Australian exports, and of course the sovereign risk that is so often associated then with joint ventures and other offshore activities, where as an Australian partner or, for example, an Indonesian partner, you're going to be a minority shareholder, and you could potentially lose all your money as a result of a shift or a change. My final slide. We also need to appreciate that attitudes to risk management are going to vary in relation to things like age and experience. We generally find that young people are more prepared to take risks than older people. And that can actually create problems for us, particularly in terms of things like farm succession. And indeed, the very reason that I wound up in academia and my career has been what it has is because my father and I couldn't agree effectively on us working together in a partnership. My father wasn't prepared to take the risk. As a young person, I was. We couldn't agree, so I had to go off and do my own thing. Our experience. Of course, the more experience we have, the more we understand the factors that contribute to risk, and thus the better able we become at managing risk. But when, of course, we're relatively new, we don't have that information, we don't have that history. And so trying to manage risk can be something that actually causes us a great deal of stress because we don't know, we don't have that experience. The amount of equity that we have in the business. So clearly the more equity we have, the bigger the risks that we can take. The specialisation and diversity of the business, as we spoke before, as a way and a means of managing risk at the farm level. By specialising, for example, in terms of constructing protected houses or greenhouses, polythene houses, plastic houses, that's enabling us to actually manage the risks a lot better than being exposed to weather events. The diversity of business, the number of different crops that we're actually cultivating, and hence then the mix that we're actually utilising within our business. And a lot of Australian farms, and indeed in many farms also within, I would suspect, Indonesia and the Philippines, you've got what we call off-farm income streams, where farmers, as they again move towards retirement age, actually start shifting some of their assets off the farm so that they can create alternative income streams. And of course, the issue that we really have to deal with today, and I see behind Sui there, the SDGs, how do we manage climate change? Because the parameters that we're trying to work with in terms of managing agriculture risk are shifting. This is the big unknown. Hell, this is October. Well, okay, early November, springtime in Australia. We had temperatures earlier or late last week in the high 30s, 35, 38. We don't expect that in October. I mean, hell. And then very heavy rain only just last night. We don't expect rain at this time of the year because this indeed is the time of year again when people are actually harvesting our crops. So you see, with climate change, the parameters that we've been used to in terms of temperature and rainfall are all changing. And that makes it harder and harder for us to be able to predict or to anticipate things like anticipated yields and quality. But there's a whole range of other personal attitudes and personal attributes that are also going to impact and influence our strategies towards risk. So I apologize that I didn't get to talk about HACCP, but I think in the interest of time, I do, and I'm very conscious that I think I'm about right where I need to be. So let me jump out, and I'll hand back to Katung as the chair to take over from here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. Peter. So maybe you can take your drink first because it's a long presentation, exactly. And okay, and this is the end of the presentation session. And next session is a Q&A, question and answer. So we have collected some questions from the participants. To Prof. Peter, maybe please answer. The curiosity of the participant was so great. So the first session, we have 3 questions, and here we can see the question. The first question is from Mr. Johnny from Universitas Jember. So maybe Prof. Peter is quiet enough to know Mr. Johnny, because Mr. Johnny is your student when in the Cartin, when he get his master degree. So maybe Mr. Johnny, if you want to turn on your camera and ask directly to Mr. Peter, so you can turn on your camera, maybe to Mr. Johnny. Mr. Johnny. Okay, maybe. I'm muted. Okay, so wait in a minute to Mr. Johnny. So Mr. Johnny, you can turn on because we are unmuted.
Thanks very much, Mas Kadung. How are you today?
Yeah.
Great.
So great.
Okay, thanks very much, Mas Kadung.
Exactly.
How are you, Peter? It's long
hey,
time
Pak Johnny.
How are you? It's great to
Good,
see you again.
Good.
Great to see you again after some 19 years ago, you know, like it's a very long time ago, yeah?
Yeah, well, hey.
How are you?
Bit of grey here, mate.
Okay. With the gray hair. Okay, Peter, I think previously on your presentation, you mentioned that there are some strategies of managing risk by avoiding, for example, avoiding the risk itself, and then using the diversity of the commodity and products, and then a specialist on the product and pricing alternative. My question is, with most of our farmers in Indonesia are small farmers, how can they do or implement those strategies with lack of capital? This is with a doubt that most of them are even running their business below economies of scale. Lately, you also mentioned about the strategies such as contract farming. So if one of the strategy maybe to integrate vertically or by contract farming or whatever. So how small farmers can engage inclusively with in the win long-term relationship. I think you talk a lot of things about this, including in my thesis as well, you know, about the commitment and trust. And could you please explain us the relationship between the long-term relationships and also the strategies of avoiding risk? And what are the role of the governments, industries, and academics to foster the process? I think this is my question. I hope, yeah, you can answer it. Thanks. Thanks, Peter.
Johnny, on you, mate. What a wonderful question. Now, how long have we got? Next week? Because you know there's so much in this question. Look, thank you, Untold. This is absolutely excellent in terms of positioning the strategy. You're absolutely right, Pak Johnny, that in terms of working with smallholder farmers, there's not much that they can do independently or individually because they are too small. That's a reality throughout all of Southeast Asia, and Indonesia is no exception. It's no different to, or you know, Indonesia, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, Bangladesh. It's exactly the same. So how do we then start to look at managing risk then from smallholder farmer levels? Certainly over the many years that I've been working with smallholder farmers, the most important strategy is indeed being able to achieve some of those economies of scale. And the way in which you achieve that is through consolidation and aggregation, and through the formation effectively of kooperasi. Now, I understand that kooperasi is not a particularly good word in Indonesia, but there are a whole lot of different ways that we can bring about this collaboration and cooperation between the farmers. How we do it, I don't really mind, but effectively it means bringing them together. And of course, first and foremost, and you already indicated that one of the main strategies that's actually utilized, of course, is contract farming. And indeed, if I recall, and I think we first met a long time ago, the great example there was British American tobacco and how it actually worked then in Jember with bringing smallholder farmers together, taking out blocks of land for the 3 to 5 years that BAT would operate, getting them to work together, paying them then a rental, establishing the shade houses, planting the tobacco, employing the villagers as labourers. You know, bingo, that's automatically reduced the risk because now farmers are employees rather than actually being itinerant farmers. We see the same sort of thing occurring, for example, in the Philippines with companies like Dole and Del Monte around things like particularly Cavendish bananas, around pineapples for both fresh market and processing, papaya, asparagus, for example. The same can also occur when I think in southern Mindanao around other industries and issues like, for example, oil palm. So again, there are two strategies here. One strategy is for the international corporation, the large companies, to just come out and buy everybody out and then plant the oil palm. But you know, there are problems with that because the land is owned by communities or tribes. So again, what they do then is they plant the oil palm themselves, but then they enter into some sort of long-term contract to be able to do that. In order then for those contracts to work, and this is how I take your point here around these long-term relationships, Johnny. In order for these contracts to work, there has to be trust. And in order for there to be trust, there has to be an equitable sharing of risk. Now, what's really interesting is that 2017, 2018, I undertook an analysis with FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, of what we called the Agribusiness Venture Agreements in the Philippines, where we looked at a whole range of these agreements, which we described basically as before, things like leasehold agreements and or contract farming agreements between smallholder farmers and companies like Del Monte, Dole, Bounty, Sumi Fresh, etc., etc., etc. One of the key issues here was that despite the fact that these are massive multinational companies, they were not willing to accept the risk. The risk was pushed onto the smallholder farmers. So that in the event then that smallholder farmers experienced a crop failure as a result of a typhoon, rather than the companies that could accept that risk dealing with it, they put it on the smallholder farmers, which meant now that the smallholder farmers were in debt. They were trapped. They actually couldn't get out then of the relationship that they had because they owed these huge debts to these multinational corporations. So that becomes then the situation, as you can see here, that in managing risk, the risk has to be shared equitably. So when we then start getting into some of the really recent work, and I mean, you've got me at a really good time in terms of how everything here relates to what I'm actually doing right now. I've just finished working with GIZ, the German International Aid Agency, on a project around public-private partnerships in the crop sector in ASEAN. And here you start now to appreciate the role of government, because now it is the role of government to ensure that in the contracts that actually occur then between smallholder farmers and these multinational agencies, this risk factor is dealt with by those who are the best capable of dealing with it. That is the multinational agencies themselves, not the smallholder farmers. You need to protect them. And so government then has ways and means of being able to ensure through legislation that the contracts actually shift the risk from smallholder farmers to the actual corporations themselves, so that there is that mutual sharing of risk. As you then suggest from the role of academics, well, this issue, Pak Johnny, is something that I still urge those of you that are out there, and I think there's 300 plus of you, if you're thinking about or wanting to look at or think about research topics potentially for masters and theses, understanding the nature of these relationships is something that we have yet to resolve, because relationships are socially embedded. And hence the relationships that we experience in Indonesia are going to be different to the relationships in Vietnam, which are going to be different to the relationships in Cambodia, which are going to be different to the relationships we experience in the Philippines, because of the cultural embeddedness of these relationships. So there's a huge opportunity here for us to actually start to look at undertaking research within this space. But the key issue here is that through concentration and aggregation, by working collectively, we get to overcome this fundamental problem of the economies of scale. We get to be able to offer our downstream customers then with the continuity of supply, the quality, and even the range of product. And by achieving then some of the efficiencies of scale, we're actually able to then get some pricing benefits. So to come back then to the core here, if we're going to manage risk, first and foremost, we have to get farmers into some form of collaborative marketing group, cooperasi, a cluster or association. I don't care what you call it, but you've got to get them together, because without that, they can't do any of this. But government needs to then set the necessary policy environment to facilitate that in terms of having contracts that are going to enable these relationships to occur between them, these farmer groups and downstream buyers, and to have a whole range of other issues around good governance, such that you may have heard of things like, for example, the VGGT. The VGGT is about having land tenure. And again, within agribusiness, ensuring that the people who own the land should have access to the land and have control over that land, because that allows them then to have collateral, which again facilitates the borrowing of money, which the farmer groups are going to need to be able to, again, put in place the infrastructure to be able to undertake the activities that they need to do. So I'm sorry, Pak Johnny, I've had to cut it there, but I could talk for another 90 minutes on your question alone. It's a great question. Terima kasih, Pak.
Okay, thank you to Mr. Johnny. A long time no see, Mr. Johnny.
Indeed.
So I hope you get the point, and someday we can meet together also. So for the next question, the next question is from Abraham Yandri. So it's also from Universitas Diponegoro. For Abraham, so maybe you can turn on your camera and ask directly to Prof. Peter.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Kadung. I want to ask to Professor Jibet about the Fuji FMEA. There are many risks that occur and disrupt agricultural activities. To identify and analyze these risks, many analytical tools can be used, one of which is Fuji FMEA. I want to ask, according to the professor, how effective can Fuji FMEA be used to identify risks in agricultural activities? Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for the question. Can I take this question again in the context of which I've just spoken about in terms of answering Pak Johnny? There are many, many, many tools that are available to assess and analyze risk. But can these tools be used by smallholder farmers? And I guess therein is the first and immediate challenge. These tools are going to largely be used by the corporates. And that's what you'd expect or anticipate. So again, if you're an oil palm and you're trying to anticipate risk in terms of, again, market acceptance, or again, developing strategies to enable you to respond to the counter claims that you're going to get, for example, from the Americans in relation to things like peanut oil or soya and or canola, that's going to effectively disrupt or impact your market potentially for things like oil. So you're going to need to be able to assess and to evaluate how this market is actually shifting and changing. So the whole concept in around fuzzy logic is enabling you to bring together this enormous complexity of different variables and to try to synthesize it and to put it into ways and manners that enable you to actually make more valuable decisions. Now, in today's presentation, I chose not to get into the actual use of these tools. There are, as you've suggested, many, many different tools and methodologies based around some pretty sophisticated mechanisms and algorithms to enable you to predict risk. And certainly, the best examples of these tools emerge actually, of course, within and at the trading level by commodity traders, where there's a whole lot of then different tools that they use to analyze the way markets are performing. And these things now, particularly in terms of buying, selling decisions in futures markets, are often automated. So a set of circumstances will actually then trigger the buying and selling on stock markets or futures markets. That's where you tend to find many of the more sophisticated tools being utilized. But at the smallholder farmer level, I really wonder whether they would have the capacity and capability to be able to do that. For them, it's much more flying by the seat of the pants, and by then, of course, embarking upon things like contract farming that provide them with that linkage to potential downstream customers. Terima kasih. Kadung, you're on mute. Kadung, you're muted.
Yeah. Thank you, Prof. Peter, and thank you so much for the answer. I hope, Abraham, you can get the point from Prof. Peter. And the next question, okay, next question is from Reza Ivan Farel from Universitas Diponegoro. So if Reza here in this room, you can turn on your camera and maybe you can ask to Prof. Peter directly. So please, Reza.
Masih pakai. Good afternoon, Mr. Peter.
Selamat siang.
Selamat siang. I want to ask a question to you. As we know, Indonesia is a developing country with a good variety of farmers, but mostly is a smallholder farmer. My question is how to increase awareness of management risk for smallholder farmers. Thank you.
You're most welcome. Thank you, sama-sama. Again, I think Pak Johnny has set the scene for us, and again, your relationship here with smallholder farmers, I come back to probably, again, where I was before, talking about the importance of bringing smallholder farmers together in some form of collaborative marketing group. As I've said, be it that a cooperasi, an association, a cluster, or whatever, I don't mind what tool or what model or what mechanism we use, but we have to be able to get smallholder farmers together. The reason that this emerges here is that this whole concept of training and of capacity building cannot be done on a one-on-one basis. Dinas Pertanian, for example, doesn't have the capacity to go out and talk to a smallholder farmer. They don't do it. They can't. There's too many of them and not enough advisors or consultants. So what we've tended to find that when we talk about bringing smallholder farmers together into these collaborative marketing groups is that provides the access to information that is so important for smallholder farmers. What's also important is that from organisations like, for example, Dinas Pertanian and again, Universitas and other agencies, we give so much consideration towards increasing productivity and enhancing productivity, sometimes even improving quality, but we give no consideration to actually linking smallholder farmers to market. And again, what started to emerge in much of the literature, particularly from the Food and Agriculture Organisation and its experiences with bringing smallholder farmers to market, is that we need to spend as much time building business management capacity within smallholder farmers. So firstly, we need to be able to build basic, marketing 101. What is marketing? We need to be able to get basic financial management systems in place, recording basic things, establishing information systems at the farm level. Because remember, if we're going to talk about risk management, and as we saw before, we actually need to have information because it's the information on which we base those decisions. So that's going to mean we're going to have information in terms of prices. We're going to have climatic information that tells us when and where, and relating that price information to the climatic information that tells us what to plant and when to plant. And so when we should then be aiming to bring that product to market. But we can't do that if we don't have information. And that's, again, one of the critical problems then that emerges within smallholder farmers is that lack of access to market information and to information that would enable them to make more informed decisions. It's also the same sort of problem that emerges in terms of smallholder farmers, for example, adopting or looking at trying new seed varieties or new crops. They can't afford to do it, because smallholder farmers don't have that capacity. They don't have the way and the means of being able to change, because change for the smallholder farmer themselves is risky. And so again, what we tend to see, and have seen, particularly with our experience in the Philippines, for example, is that again, when we bring farmers together in small groups, particularly isolated rural communities, we often find that it's these communities themselves that actually engage in new product development, in innovation, because they can spread the risk across the entire community rather than just adopt it individually, because individually they can't take risks. And we know, again, based on some experience out of the Philippines, for example, that, that the Filipino farmers, they're very good Christians. Dear God, we promise, we want you to send us a typhoon. But dear God, please send not the typhoon to our village, but send it to the next one. Because if the typhoon hits another village, they make all this extra money because the other crops have been wiped out. So again, what we find here is that farmers actually plant crops knowing that there's not much likelihood of them actually recovering costs, but they plant it as on a wing and a prayer that a typhoon is going to come, but the typhoon's going to come somewhere else. And if it does come somewhere else, then up come the high prices, and we actually see upside risk here, which is significant. And of course, there are huge benefits for the smallholder farmers. But for only 1 year, maybe in 10, does that strategy work. For the other 9 years, the farmers aren't making any money. So in order to be able to teach risk management to farmers, we have to build business management capacity among the smallholder farmers first. And so risk management then is just one of the many elements that we need to build into that. And that becomes a difficulty. We can't do it unless we manage to get the farmers first into these sort of associations or collaborative marketing groups. Terima kasih. Katung.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Prof. Peter. So we have a lot of questions. I think all of the participants is very interesting with your topic. So we could be open the second Q&A session, but before that, maybe Prof. Peter, you can take your time to drink again, because yeah, it's so very eager, very long presentation. And the second Q&A session is from Mr. Abbas Zakaria from University of Lampung. So we have a participant from Sumatra Island who want to ask to Prof. Peter, if Mr. Abbas still in here, you can turn on your camera and ask directly to Prof. Peter, maybe. Okay, Mr. Abbas, are you here?
Oke, Pak Katung.
Oke.
Pak Kadung, thank you Pak Kadung. Selamat siang Pak Peter.
Selamat siang.
Thank you very much for your explanation. Yeah, I'm very interesting for this topic. I got some problem about my farmer, especially for Lampung black pepper, lada hitam.
Lampung black pepper. Yeah, yes. I know black pepper.
Yes. Now, early 10th year, the price of the pepper is slowed down because the international price of black pepper go down. The question is, what the appropriate strategy for farmer to get their profit at the future, Pak Peter?
Okay, wow, that's another curly. Yay. Oh, I love these questions. Terima kasih. Okay. I'm going to call here on the very broad strategies that Michael Porter introduced in his 1985 publication, where he talked about competitive advantage. Porter talked about Porter talked about 3 key strategies that businesses can adopt. The first of those strategies is what he talks about from the point of view of cost leadership. Now, what we need to appreciate and understand here is that, again, we're dealing with smallholder farmers, Sumatra. Costs of production are likely to be quite low, but they're not going to be as low as, for example, India or China. And that's going to be the problem. There's always somebody somewhere in the world that can produce a product cheaper than you because of their costs, particularly in terms of things like pepper. And we've seen this, for example, in the fresh fruit and vegetable industry and the introduction of China into the world market. Prices fell basically to the level that China became the benchmark. And I would suspect you've got the same sort of situation here occurring as a result of some of the price drivers that are occurring within the market. And of course, what we describe as the lag effect, that of course is always going to occur. So if I think back maybe 10 years ago, pepper prices might have been quite high as a result of crop failures or some circumstance. That would have caused, of course, a whole lot of extra production to occur in a whole lot of extra places around the world. And as a result, pepper prices are now declining because of the oversupply of pepper. Again, that's fundamentally what the issue is here. Remember, price on the global market is determined by supply and demand. So cost leadership is not an option for us. We can't do it. The second strategy that Porter talked about was niche. And the third strategy he talked about was differentiation. Now, I don't believe that there are actually 3 strategies. I believe there are only 2. Because niche marketing is actually a differentiation strategy. What that means is that we need to, in some way or another, add value to the pepper that is being produced in Sumatra. And we need to add value because it's a particular variety, or we need to add value to it because of the fact that this particular variety in this particular agroecological situation is producing a taste and delivering something to consumers that the pepper, for example, from India can't do, or the product from China. Or we might be able to add around that pepper a whole lot of other issues associated with things like organic and or fair trade. Now, personally, I'm not a fan of organic. No, personally, I'm not. Sorry, I'm not. The problem that we have here is that smallholder farmers don't necessarily have the skills to engage in organic production. But what we can do is we can encourage farmers to adopt good agricultural practices, or to adopt and to operate under what FAO now calls agroecological practices. That's why I'm not into organic. I am definitely into sustainable agriculture, but not organic agriculture. I'm into agroecological agriculture. Because agroecological culture recognizes the context within which the farming is occurring, but it also allows us to use technologies that organic production prohibits, like the use of chemicals and like the use of fertilizers, and like even, and I'm sorry, the use of GMOs, genetically modified organisms, and or things like gene editing and a whole range of other things that allow us to potentially build into crops ways and means of those crops being more efficient in terms of their utilization of nutrients or water or salinity or whatever. But whatever the tools are by which we choose to differentiate, we've got a whole range of different mechanisms. So adopting good agriculture practice, knowing then that we've got gender inclusion, women being engaged in the product, and potentially youth employment. Fair trade premiums are going to flow back then to the community, which is going to allow then the community to engage in a whole range of other activities. That's fundamentally how I would be addressing the situation. And to use an example, this comes from much of the work that we were doing in Papua New Guinea some time ago with ACR, the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, recognising that the coffee that is coming out of PNG has a particular characteristic that no other coffee in the world has. So rather than trying to compete at the bottom end, we need to compete at the top end. But that means being able to then introduce quality management systems that provide us with the assurances that the product is being grown in the way that the market wants it to be grown. So in other words, we deliver against customers' expectations in terms of taste, locality, variety, and then environment, sustainability, and of course, fair trade and equity. Now that's assuming that they stay with pepper, because the next option that you've got to think about as well, is pepper then the best option? What are their choices? What are the other things that they could be or should be growing? What other opportunities emerge? So then you've got the opportunities to start to think here then about diversification, starting to think about if I'm correct in the way I recall pepper production in Sumatra, for example, it's a very similar environment or agroecological environment to perhaps the production of vanilla. So, you now might have a situation where you could encourage some of those farmers actually to start switching from pepper production to vanilla production. So don't forget diversification here then as a potential strategy as well. So I hope that helps. Terima kasih. Pak Kadung.
Okay. Thank you so much, Prof. Peter. So, Prof. Wan Abbas from Unila, we can get the point from Prof. Peter. So, Prof. Wan Abbas is also the former dean of agriculture faculty in University of Lampung and also a vice rector. So, thank you so much, Prof. Wan Abbas. You can join us today. It's honorable for us. And maybe the next question, the second question in the second session is from Obed Habanono from Nusa Tenggara Timur Province. So for Obed, if you are here, you can turn on your camera and you can ask directly to Prof. Peter. Obed, are you here? Hello, Obed, are you here? Okay, if I will, next question maybe.
If I can, Pak Kadung, I'll address the question while it's there. Again, I think fundamentally, if you're going to be using, and again, this relates to the earlier question that I spoke about before, in order to be able to manage risk, we need information. And that's part of the problem, that in terms of getting into quantitative risk management tools, irrespective of whether they're being used by smallholder farmers and or being used by large corporate enterprises, you've got to have information. And that becomes the critical thing. Without that information, no quantitative analysis or tool is going to work. And so that's why when I spoke about introducing risk management into organizations, so many of these organizations are actually doing it qualitatively. So in other words, they do it by things like scenario analysis, or they do it through things like Adelphi techniques, where everyone sort of sits around and you bring the people from the different organization or different parts of the organization together because they have different perspectives. And those people will talk about the foreseen risks that they have, and then they can then start to assign probabilities, and through things like Adelphi techniques, you're actually able to, again, determine where the risks arise. But particularly for smallholder farmers, the obvious challenge here is that how can they even utilize these quantitative tools without having the basic foundations of business management?
Okay. Thank you so much, Prof. Peter. But the next question, we have a question from Rwanda. So we have a participant from Rwanda that he already become a master student in Universitas Diponegoro in agribusiness program. So he asks about it's a quite the large scope of a question. Exactly, how can we manage risk in agriculture? It's a very large scope, exactly, but maybe you can give the specific one. How can we manage risk in agriculture? Yeah, because like every country face this same problem.
Yeah, and indeed that's the case, and the challenges, I guess, here are exactly the type of things that we've started to talk about here. So we're talking obviously about things like production risk. So again, if we're going to talk about production risk, well, what are the risks? And as we know here, it's fundamentally around things like, for example, climate change. And then associated with climate change, the fact that our seasons are changing, rainfall's changing, temperatures changing. So how then can we manage that? Well, it's clearly then going to come back to the choice of crops and to our or cropping systems. So we need to be constantly adjusting and modifying the type of crops that we're actually producing, and so that we're becoming and adjusting our planting times and seasons to these new climates. That's one strategy. The other strategy, of course, is to look at things like infrastructure. So in other words, and again, countries like Rwanda, for example, let's find out how much underground water there is. If you've got a substantial amount then of underground water, then let's get into irrigation. This becomes the role of these public-private partnerships that I chatted about earlier, in terms of the relationships that then start to exist between government and the private sector to actually make these investments. Let's also start thinking about public-private partnerships from the point of view of then providing or setting up a policy environment that actually facilitates or allows, as I gave you the example earlier, of the agribusiness companies like Dell and Del Monte and Bounty and SumiFresh to operate, for example, in the Philippines. They needed to have what we call the enabling environment in place that enabled them to be able to enter into the contracts with the farmers to secure the land while the farmers retained ownership of the land. And there was then a tenure of investment that was sufficient to enable then the company, let's say Dole or Del Monte, to be able to recoup its investment in terms of then developing the infrastructure like roads and or importing the machinery and the equipment and the things that it needed for it to be able to farm either bananas and or pineapples and or to pack and ship these sort of products. So you start to see how it all again operates in a systems-based capacity or situation here, that one thing leads to another, but particularly in terms of facilitating it, we need to have the enabling environment in place by the government and the appropriate policy environment to enable these policies to take place. Government can also intervene, just as it does in Indonesia right now, for example, through Bulog, in terms of offering minimum prices, for example, in the case of rice, or a price that is going to ensure that the farmers are protected. But that in itself, though, is inherently dangerous, because by not atoning to the market, you can actually wind up then subsidizing, and your cost of production can actually be greater. But you're also sending the wrong messages to farmers who should perhaps be, again, diversifying crops, but choose not to, because if I keep doing what I've always done, government's going to continue to pay me under this price support mechanism. But yet we see, for example, in the European community, of course, under what's called the Common Agricultural Policy, CAP, that what we now start to see is that farmers are being paid not to farm. That you start going, well, whoa, what sort of a subsidy is that? But the really interesting thing here is that that's not about necessarily controlling supply, but what it is about is taking the pressure off the land so that we can rest the land, so that agriculture actually becomes more sustainable. So again, we can reduce the risk there through things like price support mechanisms, and of course through things like crop insurance. And government, again, has a critical role here to play in being able to work with smallholder farmers, particularly, and or groups of smallholder farmers in their relationships with the private sector through contract farming, to provide a whole range of things that would offset the risk of, for example, a typhoon, or offset the risk of a drought or a prolonged drought that would otherwise have serious negative impacts on farmers. And then let's not forget, as we've also spoken about earlier, this risk mitigation strategy and the building of capacity within the farmers to be able to manage risk. So you see that there are many, many aspects here when we start to think about managing things at the input supply, we start to think about production, and we actually then start to think about transportation and logistics, and even then, of course, the food safety itself. And thus the legislation then that is embedded again at a government level that facilitates and encourages the adoption of food safety mechanisms by all players in the agricultural sector. Thank you for the question.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Peter. And we have the last one. So it's the last one on this session, because we have a lot of questions, but we also have the time limitation. So the last one is from Erina Galatia. She wants to compare about the risk management context in New Zealand or in Australia rather than in Indonesia. So for Erina, maybe you can ask your question directly to Prof. Peter. So Erina, So we don't have Arina here, but maybe we just want to the others question. The other question is from Miranda Natalia. So Miranda, do you hear? Do you hear me? Are you here? Miranda? Miranda? Okay, wait a minute, Prof. Peter, because...
Hello. Hello.
Okay, hello, Miranda. So you can ask your question directly to Prof. Peter. So
Okay.
time is yours, Miranda.
All right. Okay, so why the lack of capital isn't included in risk classification? Because the categories of disruption consist of four from people, premises, processes, and products. But the example doesn't include the lack of money or limited capital. And I would like to ask why. Because as far as I know, the limited working capital affects all the categories of disruptions in many ways. Yes, that's it. Thank you.
You're absolutely right, Miranda. And thank you for the question, an excellent question. What we have effectively is that with capital and finance, you're actually talking about what we would describe here as something that's going across all of the categories in exactly the way that you describe it. And so if we start to think about the lack of capital in terms of how it impacts on people, processes, premises and products, you start to see potentially how the risk is there, but it's not so much that the lack of capital itself is the risk. It's what we're saying here, it's the disruption that's going to occur. So if we start to think about people, sure, if we've got a lack of capital, well, how are we effectively going to pay people's wages? But the problem we're then going to have is, well, if we can't pay people's wages, why is that? Well, it's probably because we've got problems then with our products and or our markets. So if you start to look there at these four categories of disruption, people, premises, process, and product, markets is actually not there either. And yet markets is also embedded, like capital, within all of these four constructs. Clearly, capital is going to be an issue, but it's going to emerge as a result and as a consequence of other activities. So again, if you start to think about people, if you start to think about the people that you're employing, if those people don't have the necessary skills to actually undertake the processes that you expect them to do, you're going to have product then that becomes faulty at the other end in terms of product. That's going to have an obvious then negative impact on your cash flow. And if you've got a negative impact then in cash flow, then of course you don't have the capital that you then necessarily need to both pay your wages, but also to invest in new product innovation. Or for that matter, to be able to invest in the maintenance of your property and or your assets. So again, as we start to see here that within premises, what we talked about again before was this precautionary approach that prior to the harvest, for example, we undertake the maintenance of all the machines that we're going to use during the harvest season so that the machines don't break down, or that, should I say, there is a reduced probability of those machines breaking down. Similarly, when we start to talk about processes and particularly, again, around things like HACCP, for example, and my apologies, I didn't get to talk about HACCP today, as we did run out of time. That's there for another potential presentation in the future. That again, we can look at how we manage that. But again, in order to set up a HACCP-based system, there's a significant investment here, just as there is in setting up any other quality management system. But then having set it up, that's actually going to prove in the longer term to be more cost effective, because that's why companies engage in quality management and in risk management, because it is more profitable. It reduces their costs in the long run. So the other thing that we could also say that is missing then when we look at this disruption is this concept of time, in terms of, are we looking at short term or long term? But this category of disruption, people, premises, process, and products, is the risk management strategy or profile framework, I'm sorry, is the word I'm looking for or searching for, that is actually utilized by the International Risk Management Institute. So that's why the capital isn't there. It's like an enabling factor. It's running through all of them, just as these concepts of market are, and this concept of time. So you're absolutely right. Capital affects all of those categories. Pak Kadung?
Okay. Okay, thank you, Prof. Peter, for your great explanation, and thank you, Miranda, for your super question. Due to the time limitation, I'm so sorry that we can't collect all of the question exactly, but don't worry, because we still can meet Prof. Peter in 10 November. On the next agenda, Prof. Peter will give a lecturing about agri-food supply chain. So it's a big hope from us. All of the participants here today can follow the second class with Prof. Peter. Okay, Prof. Peter, before we end this meeting, Prof. Peter, here are some great people who are your students when they taking their master and doctoral degree. Also your college, they miss you a lot because like a couple year they can't meet with you. So they miss you a lot and want to say a few words maybe to Mr. Johnny from Universitas Jember, to Miss Nyoman Parining from Universitas Udayana, and to Miss Yosi from Universitas Pajajaran. Maybe you can turn on your camera and say hi to your great lecture to Prof. Peter. So okay, it's maybe a great opportunity when we can meet in offline, so we can say hi in online occasion. So for Mr. Johnny, Miss Parining, or Miss Yosi, you can say something, some of you words to Prof. Peter. Ya, nggak apa-apa. So, Mr. Johnny, Miss Yosi.
Okay, I just muted. Yeah, once again, Peter. Yeah, Peter. Yeah, a lot of things. I'm very glad, really glad to see you again for after almost 19 years, Pete. And it's a great opportunity for us actually to know Peter. What I know about Peter, that Peter is a great example of a human being. Yeah? He is not only a great supervisor, but also he is a great father and a great friend. A great father for his kids as well, because I know that he always have a time, to manage the family as well. He's a family man, and I have a lot of very great experience with him. But if I share the experience right now, I think I will need the whole day to talk about it. Isn't it right, Peter? Okay. So that's my comment, and I hope that we can meet again, in the near future, Peter. And I would like to promise that I will also attend the next meeting in the 10th of November, isn't it, Pak Kadung?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, it is in the 10th of November. I hope I can join the next event as well. Thanks very much. Thanks, Peter,
so too,
for great
Johnny.
presentation. I think for great sharing.
Absolute pleasure. Sama-sama.
Thank you.
Thank you, mate.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Johnny. So yeah, Prof. Peter, you can see that a lot of people that in the former occasion is your student now, they give a big impact to Indonesia, especially in their field as a lecturer, as a scientist. Yeah. So for the next, maybe Miss Yosi. So yeah, she is your college, like from Universitas Pajajaran. Maybe to Miss Yosi.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Oh, absolute pleasure. So nice to see you again, Yosini.
Yeah, thank you very much. Nice to meet you.
No, you're most welcome. So thank you.
So yeah, thank you, Ms. Yosi and Prof. Peter. So before we end this agenda, so I will make a conclusion today. So from the Prof. Peter explanation about risk management, we can know that a majority of farmers have less concern about the risk in their business. But we know that actually agricultural enterprise face huge risks from production risk, financial risk, human risk, marketing risk, until to institutional risk. So it's important to raise awareness about agricultural risk and how to assess the level of risk. So it's the simple way that I can get today in this occasion, and this is the ending of the visiting professor program. So thank you so much to Prof. Peter for your great presentation and new insight about risk management in agriculture. Also to all the participants for your participation, and see ya on the other occasion. So one again, I want to say it's so very important occasion that I can learn something new from you, Prof. Peter. So maybe yeah, we can meet in another occasion. Thank you so much, Prof. Peter, for your insight about risk management. And wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon, everyone. We can meet again in 10 November with Prof. Peter again, which the class is Agri-Food Supply Chain. Okay, thank you so much, Prof. Peter.
You're most welcome. Sama-sama.
Terima kasih Mas Kadung.
Ya, terima kasih Pak
panitia,
Joni.
Pak Arifin. Salam buat Pak Arifin ya.
Ya, ya.
Thanks. Terima kasih. Terima kasih.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you all soon. Till
soon,
November 10.
Terima kasih, Peter.
You're most welcome. Thank you. Sama-sama. Ibu Yoshini.
Yeah. Thank you, Peter.
Oh, you're most welcome. Sui, thank you.
Yeah.
No,
Thank
really,
you, Bapak Ibu. Thank you, students. See you next week.
Look forward to it. Thanks, Sui. Till then. Cheers now.
Welcome.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bapak Ibu, terima kasih. Sampai
Sama-sama,
jumpa
Bu
minggu
Siwi.
depan untuk kelas visiting professor lainnya.
Sama-sama Bu Siwi.
Ya, terima kasih Pak Joni. Terima kasih filenya Pak Joni.
Oh iya, sama-sama.
Yeah.
Hopefully it's useful. Oke, thank you. Hebat. Panitianya hebat.
Aktivis hebat, Mbak Siwi dan kawan-kawan, Mas.
Injih, matur nuwun Pramuka.